Hi, welcome. I think that's 7:30 now, so we'll get started if you don't mind. I'm hoping that some more people will join us as the morning progresses. So welcome to this International Regulatory meeting. We have some experts from a variety of territories. We've got people from Europe, America, Japan and Canada. And what we plan to do today, we want it to be quite interactive. So at any point, if you want to ask a question or a comment, just stick up your hand. I think we're going to have some mics somewhere. And we'll get some questions. We want it to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to use 3 model case studies, a tissue engineered product, which I will present, a somatic stem cell therapy product, which Kathy will present, and then a CAR T cell therapy, which Jiwen will present. We'll present each one of them individually, and then we'll have some questions. We'll pose some questions to the panel. And we want to investigate the routes to marketing for these products. If these products are efficacious, and we're assuming they're efficacious and the data that we have is good, are there accelerated routes in each of the territories? Which accelerated? Now, accelerated, I mean get to market quicker, not expedited or accelerated. All the different routes that get you to market quicker, and any incentives that there are for companies, any considerations in the various territories that you have to consider. So that's the type of thing that we're going to do. We'll do each of that, and they'll last for about 25 minutes each case study, and then there should be about 10 minutes at the end for general questions to the panel. So I'll start off. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, start first, and then I'll start the session off. So, can you introduce it?
Everybody, wow, I'm too strong. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kyselovic. I am from delegate from European Medicine Agency. I'm also sitting in the position of professor in University in Bratislava. It means I have the double position here.
Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name is Sato. I'm from PMDA, Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Agency of Japan, and I'm director of the Office of Cellular and Tissue-Based Products. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Samya Viswanathan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and a clinical translational scientist at the University Health Network from Canada.
Hi, my name is Feigal. I'm a partner in NDA Partners, a global strategy consulting firm, and I'm also adjunct professor at the College of Law at ASU.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so I'll start the session off, and the first case study is a tissue-engineered tracheal replacement. It's a decellularized cadaveric tracheal scaffold, which is then repopulated with autologous MSCs from the patient. It is used to treat what is considered an ultra-orphan indication, the tracheal stenosis of Malaysia, and there's a high unmet medical need for this particular indication. Preclinical studies that have been performed have been very supportive, and the group are progressing now to a first-in-man trial. It's going to take place in a single EU country, and they're looking for the pivotal studies under consideration and what steps we should follow next. So based on that model, could I ask the panel some questions? Sorry. So we're not going to go through all of these because we don't have the time, so I'll pick some ones that I think are quite interesting, and if I can start with you, and we can have the European route, since they're thinking about a European route. What approval pathways would you think were available for this product, and which ones would you recommend for the group to follow to get the product through to licensure as quickly as possible?
Okay, probably I will start. First of all, I have to say that it is not absolutely hypothetical product, because 13 September this year was a request from company for recommendation for qualification of this product. Probably it will be like you suggesting, tissue engineering product. It means that we are now in a regular process to evaluate these products. And the first question is,
which routes would you consider? Which routes would you think that the group should consider to get the product through to licensure as quickly as possible?
Of course, there is a lot of possibility because it's only the start on the question. But from this point of view, that it is innovative therapy and is really interesting for public health interest, then I think there should be accelerated process. Accelerated process means the company could start early dialogue with regulatory, with EMEA. It could start 6 to 8 months before, find some mutual understanding about data, how it's matured, how it's prepared, how it should be set up. Then is the first contact 2-3 months before applications. There's again question of classification of this product and starting this process. It means there could be answer mostly question before application. Then application, if it will be accepted for accelerated process, take only 150 days plus 1 month for stop clock system.
Okay.
It means I suggest that you should be really go through accelerated process of marketing authorizations.
Okay, rather than exceptional use, or you think accelerated approval would be better?
For sure, it is. There is a very easy question because it's ultra rare disease.
Sure.
It means that we feel also the exceptional condition for authorization because there is not enough data. We never get some very confidential data or very consistent data about clinical trials because there's only few cases we done. There is no possibility to make some very wide clinical trials. For the reason, any conditions for this process will be accelerated because it is very interesting for orphan drugs. And you know, orphan drugs for Europe is one of the top topics. We have a special commission for this. Probably there will be also some borderline discussion between Orphan Committee and our Committee for Advanced Therapy.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sato?
Yes, thank you very much. In the Japanese system, perhaps this indication will be assigned for the orphan designations. That will accelerate approval as a priority review. And also this is the cellular product, so the new expedite review scheme for the cellular product will be applied. So I think in the development stage, we will have some more frequent dialogue with the sponsored companies to design clinical trials and how the endpoint should be to support the development of this kind of product.
Okay, thank you. Soumya, in Canada?
Yeah, so I think from the Canadian perspective, they were going to put forward something called an orphan drug framework consistent with other jurisdictions, but this didn't go forward yet in Canada because this is an election year. So in the absence of that, I think first thing it needs to be figured out is the classification of this product, whether it comes under a device category or under a drug category, and which will then determine whether it falls under the medical device licensing pathway or it falls under the drug pathway. In Canada, cell therapies are typically regulated under one or the other, or even if it's a combination, just one of those regulations would apply. So I think that classification is sort of the first step, so you're talking to the right group of people and the right regulators. Once that's done, there are a couple of, I think, accelerated approval pathways that are present. So one is called the Conditional Marketing Approval Pathway. That's available for both drugs as well as for devices. And it looks like it would meet the condition to qualify under that program. So it has to be a serious unmet need. It needs to be a severe disabilitating condition for which there's nothing currently available, or if there is something currently available, what's proposed is significantly better or significantly decreases the risk. So a case would need to be made to say that yes, this meets all of these criteria, and they would have a pre-submission meeting at which this could be discussed. But perhaps even earlier on during the clinical trials, this pathway could be discussed, and they would make, I think, recommendations on the clinical trial design itself to say you would need very statistically sound safety data and promising efficacy data to qualify for conditional approval. And as part of the condition, as I understand it, would be a letter of undertaking to conduct further confirmatory studies, which would probably require them to collect obviously more evidence on efficacy. Whether that is or not going to be statistically significant given the ultra rare condition is something I think that the developers would have to negotiate with the regulators. So there is that flexibility and I think more of a leniency, especially for some of these orphan drug conditions, even though there isn't an actual framework in place for that. Mm-hmm. And I think the same would be true even if it went through the device pathway. There are accelerated reviews. And just to put it in perspective, the review is 200 calendar days plus the administrative, 25, 35 days that happens. So it's faster than a typical product review.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, the US?
There's 4 expedited pathways in the United States. There's breakthrough therapy, where you have to have a serious condition or disease and preliminary evidence of some substantial clinical benefit, and it can be in very early phase clinical trial. There's fast track, where you also are treating a serious condition, and you have reason to believe that your product can really be substantially better or safer than what already exists, or if nothing exists, it's the best thing out there. There's priority review, where when you submit, it's once again for a serious condition where you have reason to believe, and you actually have data, that this product is going to be substantially better than what's already out there. And there it shortens the time frame for review of the actual submission from 10 months down to 6 months. And then there's also a variety of things that can be done. Accelerated approval is another expedited pathway in the United States, where there's a surrogate endpoint. It could be a biomarker, or it could be a clinical intermediate endpoint that can be reached before the final endpoint. And there you get accelerated approval, and then after approval you have to conduct confirmatory studies to show that that intermediate endpoint or that surrogate endpoint actually did confirm the benefit. The other things that are available for ultra-orphan diseases is something we call orphan product designation. And in the United States, that doesn't require that it be a serious or unmet medical need. It just requires that the prevalence of the disease is less than 200,000. In this particular instance, of course, it's also a serious and unmet medical need. What orphan product designation does is it waives the user fee in the United States for a drug or biologic. That's $2.3 million. For a device, it's $260,000. So it's a sizable chunk of change to waive the user fee. What it also does is give tax credits. It also allows the sponsor, the person who's submitting this product, to have access to research grants from the FDA for orphan product development. I believe it's up to around $75,000 for grants. So it's not a huge amount, but it's certainly something that can be helpful. It also gives market exclusivity for 7 years. So there's a variety of incentives to use orphan product designation. Now, if some of the things that have been discussed is the jurisdiction. Is this a biologic? Is this a device? If it is a biologic, it goes down that orphan product designation, and you have the variety of expedited pathways. If it's a device, it's treated very differently. There's humanitarian device exemption, and there you can only treat about 4,000 patients with that device in order for that to be in play. There's no market exclusivity that comes with it. It does come with a waiver of fees, but it markedly reduces the amount of data you have to put forward to submit an application for approval. So there's a variety of caveats, but suffice it to say there are many different types of expedited pathways that are available if you're treating a serious condition or a condition that's very rare, and you have great data.
Thanks, Ellen. Now, one thing that you picked up on there was incentives. Could we pick up on the incentives that are available in the other regions?
Yes.
So I think for any new drug, and it doesn't, as far as I understand it, it's not just for orphan drugs. Any new drug that's approved, there's an 8-year market exclusivity in Canada, and I think 6 years of data protection. So it's not just for anything that's orphan drugs. So there's that. I don't know about the tax incentives, and certainly because there is no orphan drug designation right now or framework, I think that's missing, but something that they would like to put in place. In terms of fees, there's certainly Currently, the meetings and the pre-submission meetings do not require any fees, and there's no cost to the sponsors to have as many meetings as they would like to have with the reviewers, with the regulators, sorry, and for them to provide feedback. But that's sort of the extent that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sato?
Yes, Japanese orphan system was copied from the United States system, and we have the same kind of tax credit and also exclusivity. And the normal drug, just 8 years exclusivity, but for orphan drug, 10 years, 2 years extensions is available. And also the sponsor company can get the government grant for clinical development. And however, the number of patient criteria is different from the United States. In the Japanese case, 50,000 patients in the Japanese territory is one of the criteria of the orphan drug. The system was introduced 22 years ago. At the time, the US criteria was 100,000 patient was the orphan criteria. The Japanese population is just as half of the United States, so we calculated that the 50,000 patients. And in the Japanese system, after the revision of pharmaceutical affairs law, we have 3 categories: drug, medical device, and the regenerative medical products. But there's no distinction between these 3 categories. We equally apply the orphan concept to the 3 categories. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jan?
Okay, it is very similar for European Union, but we have a very special point. We could make process for combined products with the devices plus tissue engineering products, and it will be authorized in one process. It means there should be a very different system. There is no necessity to make the decision which one exactly is. We can make the connection both, like orphan drug versus tissue engineering drug, etc.
And one thing I just want to clarify if it's a biologic, it has 12-year exclusivity.
Oh yeah, it is a question the same. Yeah, it is much more longer.
Just wanted to add the SME status. That also
About small businesses, is that what you're asking?
Question of,
all of the regions, right?
yeah.
I think Japan and
In Europe, for sure.
For sure, we have the same. We support in this. Yeah, strongly supporting small companies, especially do orphan drugs with a special project. But it's not from our regulatory institute. This is from European Commission grant system.
The fee reduction is available for the orphan drug status.
Okay, thank you. One point that keeps on coming up is you have to find out the classification of the product quite early on, because your pathway, it determines your pathway. When do you think that you should approach the regulators, and what are the communication channels for the regulators? Dr. Sato, if I could start with you.
Communication with regulators?
Yeah.
In the Japanese system, it's different from the Europeans. And we don't have a consultation mechanism whether this product is categorized as the ATMP or so. And however, in no regulations, there used to be, if the cellular product happens, is it the drug or medical device? We're discussing with the companies. However, the new system, regardless of the drug or medical device, this kind of cellular product is evidently categorized as the cellular product. So, yes, of course, we received a question from the sponsor companies, and we responded the answer to the sponsor company. However, there's no that kind of mechanism exists in Europe.
Okay.
Also, I could continue this speak. In Europe is absolutely different. You can apply for a recommendation of a commission for classification anytime. There is no some restriction. Of course, is advised to do before process, sure, but you can do anytime, and we have 60 days to answer. Mm-hmm. We need just notes. I cannot say the full material, some deeply interesting points for manufacturing, quality, non-clinical and clinical part, but not everything. And then we can make some decision. Of course, during this process could be some dialogue. Either committee is asking company to provide more information, or company could ask on the basis of our decision what to do. And of course, this decision could go for another evaluation. If company is not very happy, it could go for our top committee and asking to evaluate this system. It means the company could ask any time about recommendation for classification, and it's free of charge. For everything. It means there's not take money.
Sonia?
Yeah, in Canada, I think at every stage of the, while you're doing investigational trials, you can have what are called these pre-CTA meetings, which are similar to the pre-IND meetings. They're formal meetings, they're on record, you have minutes that are made, and the minutes are approved and returned within 2 weeks of that meeting. And if there is a classification question that could be brought up at those meetings, and again, as they mentioned earlier, is obviously better. And then there's the pre-submission meetings again, so they're also formalized minuted meetings with the recommendations that are recorded. All of these meetings are free of charge and they offer consultation advice. So I think there's a number of places which it can be done. I think in this particular example, would make sense before you start your pivotal trial to see the kinds of data that you would need to support the conditional approval pathway. And I think the burden of proof is very different whether you're going through the medical device licensing pathway or the drug pathway.
Okay, thanks. Ellen, in the US?
Well, I think the advice is early and often, particularly if you're an investigator or sponsor that doesn't have a lot of experience working on the regulatory pathway, or if you have a really novel type of product where there isn't a lot of precedence. So the FDA has multiple venues for communication, both informal and formal. The Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research is probably the center where this type of product, it sounds like a biologic. It's possible it could be also considered a medical device, but that's probably where the jurisdiction would be for this particular one. They have what's called pre-INDs, where you can come in really early and talk about your plans, about manufacturing, about the product, about the intended indication. And these are confidential meetings, of course, but it can be done by telephone. You may or may not get formal minutes from the meeting, but it's an informal way to introduce yourself to the FDA, who the review team will be, and get some initial advice about your manufacturing, about your product. There's then more formal meetings that are milestone driven, pre-IND, before you submit to go into first in human. You'd want to have a discussion with the FDA to talk about what you've done with manufacturing, the preclinical safety and toxicology that you've done on your product, and also where you intend to go with the clinical trial. And have all those different issues discussed so that there aren't any surprises if possible, and before you submit. And then after you submit, there's opportunities along the way to have a discussion after end of phase 1, after an end of phase 2 meeting, and to talk about what your pivotal trial would look like. And in this particular instance, it's a very rare disease, so presumably it would be a rather small trial. And since the trachea is a structure that has a very specific structure and function, there'd probably be very clear endpoints that you'd have to meet. It's really more like an organ transplant in terms of what you need to do. So those are some of the venues. And of course, if there's urgent issues, there's ways to have meetings or discussions with the FDA.
Thank you.
Quick question on that point. To what extent in some of the non-informal meetings with the FDA, does FDA keep records and that have sort of I don't mean in terms of accountability, but just so that if part of the goal is to have an ongoing dialogue and getting the FDA regulators kind of familiar with your product and something very novel like this, do some of those informal meetings get institutionalized so that it has a lasting impact to actually have that meeting? Regardless of actual formal minutes.
You ask a very good question. Could everybody hear the question? So basically, it's about documenting your discussions. And that's very important. One, it's to make sure you're efficient with your product development pathway so you don't have to keep revisiting things that happen. Oftentimes your teams may change. The personnel may change. And so it's very important for what I call the sponsor, the investigator, whoever's submitting the application, who's ever moving forward with that particular product, to keep your own documentation. What we often recommend is put together what's called a target product profile of what your aspiration is, where this product is going to go, and then you fill in, working backwards, the type of studies you need to do preclinically to move it forward and what kind of milestones you need to meet. But with every meeting with the FDA, they will keep their own minutes, but it's very important for the sponsor to keep minutes, keep the official minutes, so that you don't have to keep revisiting things. The other reasons it's important is to document what the issues are, because that dead skunk in the roadway isn't going to go away. And so if something was identified, you need to make sure that you've addressed it and addressed it appropriately so that you can have a smooth pathway forward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I want to go back because I just explained a process of classification of products. Of course, we have a couple of other possibilities to make some advices. First of all, the scientific advice, which is a regular process. You can directly asking EMEA when it's postponing to our commission, and we finally it is depends. It could be 40 days or 70 days. Depends if there are some face-to-face meeting with sponsor or developer. Then decision is done as a consolidated decision from EMEA. It is very valid document. Second point is informal system, is innovative task force. Is you can make any brief meetings, either teleconference, with any partner for company, sponsor. It should be some stakeholders, it should be some doctors, it should be some companies, should be some different part of committee from EMEA, and you make the discussion about any questions.
And in terms of the minutes from those meetings?
It should be writing minutes, and it's preparing by company,
yes.
and it's verified
by the EMA
committee who is responsible for this meeting. It means the company is preparing this document, which should be valid.
The other thing I didn't mention is before you have a meeting, there's a lot of preparation. I mean, I don't know. How many of you submitted applications to the regulatory authorities? So one of the important things is to ask the questions that you need to have answered so that you can go on to the next step, and make sure the package of information that you provide, at least in the FDA, we have to provide it 30 days in advance. They don't like to be surprised with new data on the spot. So prepare a package that will help inform how to answer the questions that you have. So it's really a process where the sponsor is really pushing what they need to do, and make sure you get your questions answered as much as possible.
Thank you. Okay, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move on to the next case study, which Kathy's going to present. Thank you. Are you interested?
So are there any questions from the audience on the first? No? Okay. So hello, I'm Catherine Tsokas from Janssen Pharmaceuticals, and I'm going to talk about the second case study, which really is a large indication, adult somatic stem cell therapy. And what we tried to do is really take some examples from the sponsor's perspective of information that we've had that was obtained on a project, and how we, as Jacqueline said, how we could move it along, accelerate development and treatment for this product. So it's an adult somatic cell therapy. It's used for single treatment. It's a large indication, so it's not orphan. We were thinking about, when we wrote this hypothetical, that we could use heart failure as an example. So there's a high unmet medical need, and there is a large economic burden. So the company has received positive phase 2 efficacy data. However, the primary analysis was not positive, or not statistically significant, but they did do ad hoc analyses which did show statistical significance. It was the phase 2 was placebo-controlled. There was 150 to 300 patients in a single region clinical protocol, and they have safety data from a phase 1, and 2 protocols in approximately 250 patients. So I know there's a lot of questions here, but these are just some examples that we could start with. But I was going to start and ask the panel, from your individual regions, would you think that the information that we've had on this hypothetical would support conditional approval, with the understanding that confirmatory studies would be required? So, Ellen, sure, Ellen can start with you.
Well, the short answer is no. That if you failed on your primary endpoint and you're then doing ad hoc analysis, they might be hypothesis-driven for your subsequent trial, but that would not be the basis for approval.
Short answer is maybe. So there's 2 pathways. So there's the conditional approval pathway and there's the priority review pathway. The priority review pathway for larger unmet needs, again, it has to fulfill conditions of being serious, life-threatening, severely debilitating, for which there's no marketed drug, or if there is one, this one is significantly better, statistically significant, or significantly decreases the risk. But that data needs to be based on valid endpoints, so no ad hoc analysis. It needs to be statistically significant to qualify for priority review, which is a much shorter pathway. It's 180 calendar review days. This sounds like it wouldn't meet that criteria, so I think it could fall under the conditional market approval criteria, but again, the sponsors would have to make a case that the current treatments that are there for heart failure are somehow not as good as the product, as the adult somatic cell therapy product, or that the risk is lowered to a significant extent. And the data would need to be, at least from a safety perspective, statistically significant. Even if the efficacy is not, they could then make a case for how they would design further confirmatory studies that could achieve statistical significance.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, in a Japanese regulation, we have a conditional time-limited authorization for the cellular products. However, there are some conditions whether this system can be applied for this kind of product. I will raise some point. The one is that it is quite sensitive that it says no, sorry, not statistically significant and ad hoc analysis, statistically primary analysis. So the conditional approval requires the likelihood of clinical benefit in the phase 2 data. So I'm not quite sure from this wording that it can be applied for the clinical for the conditional approval. And usually for the heart failures, we request the hard endpoint phase 3 data with the survival. But it depends if this heart failure is a serious heart failure and last line therapy, we have to consider the kind of medical conditions. And also how this drug is administered to the patient. It is invasive or not invasive, and compared to the seriousness of the disease. All that kind of things should be considered when we apply the conditional approval of the cellular therapy.
Okay, I could summarize all these attitudes are the same for our decision. However, I was asking to make some strong decisions here, but I have to say that high probability no. It's not possible to forego conditional approval. Each fact are relevant also for us, but also there is a very important point. Conditional approval means that during the next period we'll get enough clinical data for benefit and risk of the system. And if the phase 2 was not significant, we cannot expect it, they will be very significant, which will be change our approval. It means that this system is showing that it should go for full authorization. It means there are no exceptions for any point.
So I was interested, so several of you mentioned the risk-benefit analysis, and so in regards to this, and I do want to get to some of the questions regarding the data that we could have, but can you speak to, from a conditional approval or accelerated approval, are there any differences in regards to the risk-benefit analysis? So what do the different regions take into account as they're assessing the risk-benefit for cellular therapies, for therapies of, if there's any differences with that in that regards?
Well, I think risk-benefit is always it's a judgment call. It's not that there's a mathematical formula you can work out and this much benefit, this much risk, you know. So it is a judgment call. I think if it's, you know, say congestive heart failure can cover a lot of conditions. It can be acute heart failure, it can be chronic heart failure, it can be post-MI, you know, 5 years out. So there's a variety of medical issues that are relevant in that judgment call of benefit risk, and it has a varying degree of judgment based on what other clinical therapies are out there. So it could change certainly depending on if you have a refractory condition for which there really are no effective treatments, where the regulatory authority could work with you to figure out what those endpoints of interest were. So it depends on the medical practice in that particular country. It depends on the access to expert physicians taking care of that condition. And so that's also going to color the benefit risk evaluation.
I could say absolutely identically sentences because there is too many questions, especially about heart failure. In this end stage situation with close to transplantation, there is some not possibility to go through transplantation. Then could be only one possibility, as a cost benefit is just a question of risk for patient to survive. It means there is too many questions. And second point, I'm absolutely sure at this point, from academic point of view, the cost benefit risk is identically verified for all our regulations, because we're the same type of people, the same type of thinking. We are not too different between our medical systems.
Yes, it's sometimes very sensitive to discuss the cost benefit. Usually, we are regulators of the drug regulation, and we discuss the risk benefit, and cost benefit is sometimes another discussions.
Oh, sorry, I was using it for my. I told you in the style is a professor of pharmacology. It means I start to question the cost, but regulatory system is out of any money questions. Okay, sorry for this.
Yeah, I think exactly what the panel has already said. I think the thing has to be reviewed in Canada, at least from a Canadian context, of what is available and what techniques are performed and what's the standard of care. And because there are other treatments that are available, which may not be as effective, I think this would have to be compared with that. But a case can be made for conditional approval, but it would be a harder case than it was in the previous example, I think, which was where there really wasn't anything out there, and it's a very ultra-rare condition. So this would be a much harder sell, but it could be made under the conditional approval process, yes.
So if we were to say it was a chronic heart failure, and, you know, can you provide some insights potentially on the patient exposure data that would be necessary? So, because right here I realize that, you know, our hypothetical product is saying ad hoc analyses, but any insights in regards to patient numbers, exposure-wise, that would be necessary? And I know you can probably add in some clarification points when you respond to that question.
Well, I think, you know, part of it is how you think your product will perform. So there's not an absolute number of patients that need to be exposed. Part of it is what you think the performance value of your product is going to be in that indication. And so, for example, you know, there's been some recent approvals in congestive heart failure this year, and there were 6,000 to 8,000 patients in each trial. So those are situations where they're looking at mortality endpoint, and they're trying to make a difference of 15%. If you have a cell therapy, and what we all believe is that it's going to have more dramatic effects, it's possible that because of the magnitude of effect that you see, you think that the number of patients you'll need to show an effect will be a smaller sample size. So it's possible you could reach effectiveness with a smaller sample size. You may need a similar denominator of patients to show patient safety, but you may be able to get on the market sooner because you've shown the magnitude of effect is so substantial and you have at least some adequate evidence of safety.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the endpoints and how you define heart failure, and I don't know that there is a lot of consensus on this, and I think a lot of sponsors have been looking to actually look at composite endpoints, you know, where they're looking at multiple things, so maybe mortality in the 30 days after the transplantation, worsening of symptoms, you know, and how they classify the symptoms and severity. It's also, there's different classification systems, so I think different regions subscribe to different classification systems, whether there's increased incidence of hospitalization. I mean, there seems to be multiple endpoints, so depending on the endpoint or points that you choose might determine your sample size and again the effect that you're trying to get through. Again, if there's a conditional approval process and you're going through that, that's something that could be negotiated with the regulators to figure out what effect they would like to see in the confirmatory studies and whether that needs to be statistically significant. As the regulation is written, it's supposed to be statistically and clinically significant, but there may be some wiggle room there in the interpretation of those regulations, which can allow the sample size to be lesser than it may need to be to achieve that.
In the United States, I neglected to add, in 2010 there was an FDA guidance on cell therapy and heart disease. So you'd want to, the point there is if there's guidance, look for it, because oftentimes there might be helpful advice for particular diseases. So just wanted to bring that point up.
Yeah, and the exposure of the number of patients is very difficult question because it's case-by-case decision depending on the endpoint and the threshold level and the statistical robustness of the data. So, but I think I follow the previous two speakers that usually we request the hard endpoint study, and which demonstrates the confirmatory efficacy for the kind of product. However, if we apply conditional approval, it's very hypothetical case. I don't say it is applicable to this kind of product. However, if we can apply the conditional approval, this is the just the intermediate stage of the whole development of the product. So at the phase 2, I'm not quite sure, but the sponsor can demonstrate the likely clinical benefit at the stage of phase 2. But it can be a surrogate endpoint, but in a heart failure model, it's very difficult to find the very appropriate surrogate endpoint.
From my point of view, it's really very difficult to say any answer because I have two major questions here. First, what kind of cells it is? It is autologous bone marrow, it is some cultivation cells, it is some treated cells, etc., etc. And second point is system of application. It's going to intravenous injection, or it is going to open surgery of heart and inject into the muscle. It's absolutely limited what you can able to do, because the answer for this disease is very complex and very problematic from the clinical point of view. How to measure the results.
So does that? So when you're looking at the risk benefit for a product, and if a product was for several cell therapies, if it was an invasive procedure to deliver it, so you that is part of your equation when you're looking at risk benefit for treatments.
For this point, I could answer the safety is very high because there was 1,000 of patients undergo such a intervention. It means that too many cell therapy was used for infarction, for heart, and we has very less or almost nothing unwanted reaction or very dramatic unwanted reactions. The question is the efficacy. How is the effect of this treatment? Because it's very difficult to measure it and it's very personalized for each patient.
So I'd like to add that the regulators highly encourage sponsors to submit risk management plans with their submissions and talk about the different kinds of risk, whether it's a procedural risk or there's the other risks that are there and how they need to be mitigated and what their strategies are. And that's part of the risk-benefit evaluation that the regulators will do. So, being cognizant of that and kind of proactively addressing that is something that's highly recognized and throughout the product life cycle. So during clinical investigation, but after as well, during marketing as well as post-market stages, it needs to be throughout.
I mean, one thing we didn't mention in terms of risk is the type of cell you're using. Here it sounds like it's an adult cell, so there may be, less risk about proliferation. There may be less risk about the cell continued survival. There may be less risk about tumor, a variety of things that are different with adult cells than with pluripotent stem cells. So part of it is about the cell itself. The other part is about the procedures. It's something that's going to be given as part of routine cardiac cath, post-MI, place the stent, squirt in some, antithrombotic agent, and at the same time you squirt in, your product. Or is this an invasive separate procedure where they're injecting something into the heart? So there's a lot of issues. I hate to always say it depends, but there's a lot of details that need to be understood, and those come into the judgment calls.
So if this product were, with all the caveats, were to obtain conditional approval in one region, so I'll just use if it did perhaps contain conditional approval in Japan, what are some of the impacts in regards to how other regions will then look at reviewing this product for approval in their regions? Do you take into account?
Generally, I could say there is no direct impact. There's no direct effect of our decision. However, any reporter or assessor will be thinking about this process which is done in different regions, especially in Japan. There's no direct effect for sure.
Yeah, the United States, they would do their own review, meet the criteria that they expect, because each country has its own regulations and laws that you have to abide by. So they certainly would be knowledgeable. These agencies interact all the time, but they'd still do their own independent review of the submission.
Yes, if in this case European agency take a approach of the conditional approval, yes, I think in the Japanese regulation it's not direct effect for the review process. However, we will assess, we will lead the review report of European agency, of course, and also we have to think about the clinical impact to the Japanese medical situations. Maybe some medical backgrounds sometimes different in each regions, and this could be accommodated in a review process.
So it'd be similar in Canada as well. They would look at the review, but it's not binding. And certainly if letters of access were provided by the sponsors, they would be able to look at the other regulators' comments and concerns, but it would be reviewed again in the Canadian context.
So can you provide some insight in regards to, so I know that EMA and FDA, you can request joint meetings. Sponsors can request a joint meeting for certain review topics. But can you just provide some insight maybe how some of the agencies interact offline?
Well, there's all kinds of ways that the agencies have been interacting for decades with, probably initially with United States and with Europe, but then with Canada and with Japan, and I think more recently with Australia. So they have formal and informal communication venues. They also have confidentiality agreements, so they can have conversations about specific products as well.
especially I have to say that for scientific advices, we could have a joint decisions for this point, both for no authorization, but for scientific point of view, we can be joint decisions.
So I'm afraid the Japanese agency that doesn't join this joint scientific advice scheme. But the Japanese agency has a confidential agreement with these three regions, Canada, US, and EU, and we can have channels to exchange informations. However, it's very difficult to intervene the decision of other agencies because we are independently decide on the basis of each cases in their medical conditions.
So I know we have about 2 minutes left. Are there any challenges that you face in your regions as you're looking at these advanced therapies or cell therapies that you think convergence may help, or just something that you can share with sponsors how we may be able to help address some of the challenges as you're reviewing our cell therapy products?
Well, if I could turn it around, since it's an international panel, one thing that we should bring up is that foreign data outside of the host country can be used, as long as the medical condition is similar across those different jurisdictions, as long as the expertise to take care of those patients is competent, as long as the clinical trial has been conducted with good clinical practice, informed consent, ethical review. So I do want to make it clear that you don't start over. You can use data that's been done in other countries, and there has to be access to that patient-level data, but it can be leveraged.
Oh, it's absolutely the same. The clinical trials could be used for both sides. If you use it for FDA, it's absolutely free to use also for EMEA, but evaluation will be maybe slightly different, but you can use the data, for sure. There is not strictly, it should be done only for European system or European style.
Yes, we can use the foreign clinical data as long as the data is corrected in the GCP process, and this is we follow the ICH type of guideline, the GCP, and also the interpretation of the ethnic difference. So in some cases, we request the Japanese data to extrapolate the result in other regions, depending on the medical conditions.
So in Canada too, I think you can go directly to a drug submission process, even if the data is generated outside, as long as the medical practices can be applied to the Canadian context and can be interpreted there. And in Canada also, they follow the ICH guidelines. So in that sense, the regulators are harmonizing with other jurisdictions, and they have memorandums of understanding with other jurisdictions to discuss confidentially at least safety data in between submissions. And they're looking at ways, participating in APAC workshops in Asia and other workshops with the FDA and EMA and Australia, TGA, I think to kind of have convergence and harmonization in a growing field, right? I think they're looking to learn as much. So it seems like they're being proactive and taking an open approach. So
I think one of the challenges you asked about is often the sponsor, this is new for the regulatory authority too, so actually from the sponsor, you know your product best. And so we've certainly seen instances where the sponsor has educated the regulatory group about what the issues are with that product, with that particular disease. So there are opportunities for not just data to flow, but enlighten the perspectives about what the issues are with your particular product, because you are the group that knows your product the best, and they are receptive to hearing what your viewpoints are and what the scientific issues are. It's always a scientific conversation. It's not promotional advertising, but it's based on scientific information that you've gleaned either from your own work or from others in the field.
So thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce Jiwen for case study 3.
I think some of the generic themes already been discussed. But I just want to kind of frame a little bit. When Kathy, Jacqueline, three of us trying to put this session together, I think the intent is really, we are so passionate about this field and we really have high hopes. So we really want to get to the market as soon as possible. That's number one. Number two is we're all very excited and encouraged by Japan's regenerative medicine regulations and try to see how we can leverage that Japan's scheme and potentially even further accelerate development approval. And number three is, I think for CAR T is a little bit specific or unique compared to the last two scenarios is the manufacturing process is such a huge challenge. So when we're trying to race to the market as soon as possible, we may try to consciously decide to sacrifice the manufacturing part at the beginning, but then we still have to come back to really how to optimize the manufacturing process and then implement those changes. So that's number three. And number four, I think the intent is really we try to leverage the Japan some of accelerated approval mechanisms, but still we want to global marketing and how to make sure if we get to one market very early, that is going to jeopardize or at least risk some of the development criteria or schemes in other regions or countries. So those are the intents when we put this session together. I think when I try to describe the scenario, maybe it's a little bit too real because I look at all the current descriptions of the, go to clinicaltrial.gov and see who's doing what. So this is how the scenario was described. But essentially, the key here is phase 1 data is already very promising, miraculous, put it that way. And phase 2, we're anticipating is going to be very successful as well, even though it's going to be based on the response rate instead of survival endpoint. And then, but meanwhile, the phase in parallel to the phase 1 the first indication development, we're also trying to pursue much larger indication. And as I mentioned before, meantime, we're also trying to manage the manufacturing changes as well. So several themes are ongoing, and I was already told yesterday when we have the preparation meeting, the last question is really my wishful thinking. They're not going to accept. But that's fine. We can continue to ask if we want. But anyway, so that's really the key kind of elements of the program is we have seen the positive data, very positive, and we're planning the phase 2 study, anticipating it's also very positive, even though it's a response rate endpoint. And we're also trying to do the conventional long-term follow-up. So the question actually to the panel members is really, would that be adequate? Just assuming we can manage the toxicity, phase 1, phase 2 together. We got very, talk about effective size, right? We have very positive data. Would that be adequate to follow some accelerated approval pathway to get to the market? And since I think a lot of the questions of scenario description are a little bit US oriented because the manufacturing challenge is trying to expand. So I will start with Ellen. Give us some insights.
So your question is, if you have dramatic clinical endpoint results in phase 1 and 2, will that expedite traveling through the FDA system? And I think the high level answer would be probably. If you have dramatic results in an unmet medical need, one, at a minimum, you'd probably classify for breakthrough therapy designation. It's possible, depending on the magnitude of the results and how your trial was designed and what the endpoints are, it's possible you could either get an intermediate or a full approval based on that. Intermediate may be based on there's a clinical endpoint that you've clearly measured, and maybe you've measured it at 1 year rather than 5 years, but you've got really good results. So I think the short answer would be the FDA will try to help you expedite its pathway to patients. You still have to have a product. So the issue is how close is what you used in the early phase trial to the commercial product. It's possible that what you need to do, I think, is really discuss with the FDA early what happens if you succeed. So that if you are in the process of changing your manufacturing, particularly for biologics, particularly with cells, you've worked with the FDA ahead of time on what those comparability assays will need to be to go between what you used, because usually you want to use the finished product in your pivotal trial. That's your aim, is to do that. If you haven't done that, then you either have to deal with comparability or some sort of potency assay or some sort of bioassay that compares it, and you either have to get that done or maybe post-marketing, you do need to complete that.
Can I ask Yang?
I have to say that on the basis of this very simple information, it's a very high probability that it could go for for this conditional approval, because really we can expect the next phase 3 show consideration data which is fit to our system. Also, when I see this showed information, I think that we could go also for accelerated process. It's slightly different process, and company could ask much earlier about conditions, how to prepare all these clinical trials to finalize a very rapidly process for authorization, which take only 150 days, and go for full authorization without very specific obligation after authorization process.
Dr. Sato,
yes, I hear the over-expectation on the expedited process of cell therapy in the Japanese system from Jiwen. However, the conditional and time-limited authorization for the cell therapy product in the Japanese regulation is quite similar to the accelerated approval of the United States. This is just the cell therapy version of accelerated approval. And as I have a look at these cases, however, it is quite limited information, but it can be applied to the conditional approval as other regions do. And if the sponsor companies apply at the same time to the NDA application in the Japanese review system, perhaps we can harmonize the timing of the decisions. That may benefit the patient for the early access all over the world. And also, I have to say that this case will be orphan designations applicable. This is ALL patient. And if there is no other treatment option in the last line therapies, this will allow us to review more rapidly. And also, in this years, we started the trial of the Japanese version of breakthrough therapies. If it is designated, assigned as the breakthrough therapy in the Japanese regulation, it will more accelerated in the process. So, however, perhaps after the conditional approval, we will see the long-term follow-up study data, for example, the survival data of the patients. Perhaps other regulators in the other region will do the same thing. And I have to say another issues of the manufacturing. Usually this kind of conditional approval and accelerated process is very clinical driven, and usually in a clinical reviewer is left behind in the decision process of this kind of accelerated process. So perhaps we ask the sponsor to front load every kind of GMP activities and the validations and other kind of things. So we have to keep it in your mind. And manufacturing change after the approval will subject to the variation applications for confirming the comparability between the two process, the process before changing and the process after changing. So I think this is the same process. This is same concept with US FDA, and but we have to sort out the timing of the process change and the addition of the new indications, and perhaps we will have to discuss the sponsors so frequently to sort out that kind of issue.
Thank you.
How many different regulatory bodies view in programs like this that many of the patients treated were at maybe a single site or only 2 sites? And so they're looking for obviously an approval when there's really almost an academic medical center or 2 home universities that trialed most of the patients. And so it really wasn't a broad multi-center trial. How does that factor into the regulatory discussion? You see that a lot of CAR T, they're all coming out of medical centers.
Can I just interject a little bit? I think for phase 1, that's very likely that's what's happening. But for phase 2, if you want to do 150 to 200 patient trial, I imagine it has to be at least multiple sites. And when I searched at clinicaltrial.gov, it does seem that way. It's, but
it would come into play if this was just a single site versus people would want to know is it technology that's exportable and doable, not just at a boutique. Now it's possible, say for the tracheal example earlier, you probably would have referral centers where patients would have to go because presumably this isn't something you can do in every medical center across the country. So part of it depends on the rarity of the disease and where the expertise lies to use this technology and administer this kind of therapy. But the FDA does take that into consideration about is this just unique to this one place or are the results. And when they do their analysis, they look at regions. They look at was there a particular prominent place that did particularly well or particularly badly, and they do see that. And then they do analysis taking that center out to see what the results would be.
Yes, in the Japanese regulations, we don't care about number of the clinical sites, but it sometimes affect the credibility of the statistic data. We just care about that. However, in this case, perhaps we will request the Japanese patient data. In that situation, it's a matter of the what kind of preparation this product is produced. Could you preserved or not? If it is cryopreserved product, you can convey the product from US to Japan, and the Japanese patient can enroll the clinical trials.
So from a Canadian perspective, not just to answer your question, but your earlier question, certainly it could go both through the conditional approval process or the priority review. But as was mentioned, typically these products are already considered to be of high quality. So these are not mechanisms that are typically used for manufacturing changes, but rather to address the efficacy question once the safety profile has been established. It would meet the criteria for both, so it would be up to the sponsor to make a case for whether they would like to do conditional approval, which is possible if there is an intermediate clinical endpoint that has not been validated, and in further confirmatory studies are going to use validated clinical endpoints like survival. The priority review will be based on using validated endpoints, so they'll need to meet that criteria to begin with. So it's up to the sponsor to kind of make the case for which they could go. They can only go for one approval process. So if they go under the priority review, they won't be considered under the conditional approval, or vice versa. There's some differences in terms of the confirmatory studies that are required that follow on, and the size of that and the statistical significance of that that'll come out of which pathway is ultimately chosen for that.
The other thing we didn't bring up is sometimes there'll be a patient registry, particularly in rare disease with innovative technologies. So it's understood that in the context of the clinical trial, there's a finite number of people that you can observe, but there might be a commitment to commit to a patient registry where everybody who gets that technology enters into a database in terms of safety and efficacy endpoints. And generally, we do try and acknowledge, across country type registries, so there's not duplication of effort in those registries.
Especially for European Union, we have not such a rules how many centers is to be done, but it's question of technology, question of products, etc. But if you do only one center or very small number of centers, you have to expect too many questions. Why? And you have to have a very nice story to answer what's happened, because you are asking for general authorizations for whole Europe. And this question why you're using only one center and one technology. The answer should be very clearly set up what's happened. Probably it looks for conditional approval for these questions, and next steps should to be done much wider. This is clinical trials.
Any other comments or additions from the audience on this? I have more questions, but before we move on to from the clinical to the manufacturing part, any other comments or thoughts? So I think Dr. Sato kind of touched on my second question is about Japan, whether the specific data from Japan would be needed. But the second aspect is about this CMC part, the manufacturing change. So what we are trying to get here is, with the first process, if we use the old process, or whatever current process, but then for the second indication, we try to optimize with closed system, automated system, so we have a much more efficient process for the second indication. The question is, I know it's going to be a difficult one, is if this new process is used to support second indication, and the second indication is positive, get approval, what will be the comparability? Do we need to do additional comparability assessment for the first indication, or the data from this second indication is already adequate to support change for the first indication as well? Ellie, you want to start?
I think it depends. Acute leukemia is not non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, so there are issues with the indication, and I think it brings up the point. Talk to the FDA about what the comparability. Is there an assay? Is there just an assay you could do that could show that they're similar, identical in what you want to achieve? Hopefully that could be done. It's possible you might need to do more extensive comparability. But I think the bottom line is talk to the FDA about what you think is going to be required. Plan for success. If you're doing a trial, presumably, you've got an endpoint where at least you have a chance that you could be successful. And it's understood that the manufacturing, you may not want to invest, millions of dollars into very high-tech, efficient processing for very early clinical trials where you don't know if it's going to be an active agent. But if you are starting to get clues that this looks like it could work, it would be good to start doing your manufacturing changes so that at least some of the patients on those pivotal trials that you want to submit are being treated with that commercial grade product. Otherwise, you do have to, deal with talking about comparability issues.
Doctor, yeah, please.
Okay, it's a very open question. It's a very wide possibility there, because question is of quality of this product, as it also is how is difference between single preparation and manufacturing. Is there some different steps during this process, or is it really different process to do commercial products? For the reason, generally, I have to say that probably you will need some clinical trial to verify this data with new product. Second point, but it's really open. If there is very small changes and quality of product is very easily to verify, it is necessary to do just quality verification, not clinical effect verification. It's a really very open question for this point, and it's very difficult to answer simple, we need or not we need. But what is sure, it will be much easier to do this process, because if we verify once, then it's our internal process, and it's going much easier to verify this again, such a simple, because we ask just a couple of questions what to do. Probably during the discussion with company, we'll get and prepare exactly itinerary how to do this process.
Also, all of them are going to require a pre-approval inspection.
Yeah.
So they do want to make sure the product is ready to go into patients.
Yeah. Also, there will be some for sure for new indication will be the same process how was developing this manufacturing system. It may be a lot of questions there, and depends of how is different manufacturing process.
I think important to show that in your comparability studies that the mechanism of action in a new indication is comparable to the mechanism of action in the old, even though you've had manufacturing changes, and that is conserved so that you can apply the results from one trial retrospectively to another. So I think a case for that has also to be made by the sponsors.
Yes, when we have a look at the additional clinical data for the new indications, perhaps our clinical reviewers review the dossier as the quality of the product is consistent, and in yes, they presume that the quality of the product that was used for the clinical trials is consistent to the product which before manufacturing change. So the quality assessment is doing separately in the Japanese regulatory systems. However, of course, we will see the comparability of the two products before changing the manufacturing process and after changing the manufacturing process. However, this is a cellular product, and we can. I'm not quite sure we can apply the conventional way of biopharmaceuticals to compare the quality aspects of these two products. So I think we encourage the early discussions of the sponsors to the regulatory agencies for which kind of parameters do we use for assessing the comparability in the process.
So I think those are really the high things we want to touch on. We have 2 minutes, maybe just any questions or comments from the audience. I know CAR-T is exciting, and we're really, as I mentioned, we're really hoping we get to the market as soon as possible, and also get global registration as well. But if not, with that, thank you.
I want to hear, or maybe other countries, your opinion about the Japan deregulation policy change. So regarding Japanese deregulation policy change, how the U.S., Canada, or EMA think about? What's your opinion?
Are you asking what do we think about Japan's experiment in regenerative medicine? Well, we're all watching it. We know that products are going down that pathway, and I think we're all quite interested to know the outcome of how that works. It seems to be a well-designed experiment, and so I think time will tell. I think the other regulatory, certainly in the United States, there are accelerated and expedited pathways if you have good data to take your product through to market. And I think people are trying to address that.
Yeah, it's absolutely identical point of view. It's a very hot theme for us, and we try to understand all these steps.
Same with Canada. They're very open, and they're participating in other workshops and keeping abreast of what's happening with the regulations. But they have a conditional approval pathway that's been available since 1998. And one of the first cell therapy products, Prochymal, was approved under that pathway in Canada. So there is mechanisms for that there. But reimbursement hasn't quite kept up with regulatory approval. So I think there's that kind of dichotomy, at least in the Canadian system, which seems to be better addressed in the Japanese system.
I think that's an issue for the U.S. too. If something gets out early, there's no guarantee. We don't have a guarantee that anybody would pay for it. We do have ancillary type access to patients for very effective treatments, or even just for experimental treatments. And I don't know if you know, in this country there's 23 states that have passed right to try, but basically that doesn't force the manufacturer to provide it, and it doesn't force insurers to cover it. So I think coverage, when it comes out very early, maybe for rare diseases it will be less of an issue, but congestive heart failure probably would be a big issue.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not in the position to comment on the Japanese regulations for your questions. However, I think each regulatory agency thinks about the early access of the promising product. I think this concept is the same all over the world. But the way of the accelerated approval or breakthrough therapy or priority reviews, so what sometimes slightly different. But the goal is the same.
So any other questions for our regulatory expert panel? Okay, so thank you very much. I think, I know they were hypothetical questions, but I think it really helped just provide some insights and maybe some guidance as to what's out there in the different regions and how sponsors can address some of the challenges that we have and that we know that you have as you're reviewing these various products. So the general session starts at 9, and I just want to put a plug in for, we have, I believe it's at 10:45, the regulatory panel where we'll be discussing regulatory convergence and accelerated pathways. So that's today in the main general session. So thank you for coming so early. We appreciate it.